political correctness is actually useless, right? Because it doesn't actually let us have real, authentic conversations. It's sort of just like a veneer that we're functioning within. If there is a better word or a better phrase or a better expression that I can use, then why wouldn't I opt for it? You need to do all of these efforts in an intersectional way. I'm not just a woman. I'm not just my sexual orientation. If I ask either of you, okay, tell me one identity factor that describes you and that's it, you're leaving so much of who you are and all of your complexity on the table. We've seen countless examples of, say, a facial recognition software, voice recognition that can't recognize people who use different dialects. How is that a useful product?
Welcome to the Generation Hustle Podcast, a show that explores the world of business, entrepreneurship, and culture, all centered around the millennial. I'm your co-host Sheriston, alongside my good friend Amin, and today we're exploring an important topic that has taken the forefront of social justice: diversity and inclusion. Episode 32 is with Dr. Sarah Saska. Dr. Saska is the co-founder and CEO of Feminuity, a management consulting firm that helps companies build diverse teams, equitable processes, inclusive products, and cultures where people belong. Before founding her company, she led pioneering doctoral research detailing the need for technology and innovation that is equitably and ethically designed. She has delivered TEDx and keynote talks around the globe and was named amongst WXN Canada's top 100 most powerful women in 2015 and 2017. We sit down with Dr. Saska as she details the importance of diversity and inclusion in today's world. She highlights the issue of representation at the C-suite level, political correctness, and the need for an intersectional view of individuals. This was an incredibly informative conversation that sets the bar for 2021, the year of accountability, as she puts it. So without further ado, Dr. Saska.
Awesome. Well, thank you to you both. I appreciate the ask, and I'm happy to be here.
Oh yeah, let's just get this started. As I mentioned earlier, diversity and inclusion has become such a, quite the hot button topic in recent years, as a lot of companies are now continually using it almost as like a marketing tool for hiring in businesses in general. So first, in your own words, can you help us define what diversity and inclusion actually mean? And does it exclusively only relate to, say, race and gender?
So many things to unpack there. I love it. Okay. Yeah. So what does diversity, equity, and inclusion, like what does it mean in the context of the workplace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, from my perspective, it's a field of practice that ultimately brings social justice into the workplace. And I think the only reason we don't necessarily use the language of justice or social justice is because it really just hasn't been sort of the norm to talk about in the context of many workplaces. And I think for many years, it's not been considered sort of a palatable approach or conversation, right? For many years, we've talked about the fact that we need to keep our personal lives out of the workplace, right? That we need to separate our personal life from our professional life. And that perhaps there's no room for politics in the context of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
But those days, I don't know if they actually ever really existed, but if they did, they're gone, right? So for me, diversity, equity, inclusion as a field of practice is about figuring out how to bring more justice into the context of the workplace, to make more equitable systems, to make more human systems for everybody.
Right. And so that's a great point. I think a lot of people get tied into thinking like diversity and inclusion. And I think I've had discussions with a few individuals as well, and they only specifically think it's race and gender. So it's beyond that kind of scope, right? And so why do you believe it's such an important factor today for companies when it comes to hiring? Because, and how has that concept kind of evolved over time? And is education and exposure within media really something that has driven a huge impact on this subject matter?
You like to ask 10 questions in one question. You're really sneaky. I see you. Okay, well, to the piece around is diversity, equity, inclusion only about race and gender? Absolutely not. However, many organizations, they have definitely treated it as such, right? For too long, especially if we look at the tech sector, right? Lean In. Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, came out a number of years ago, and it was all about sort of encouraging women within the context of the workplace. Ultimately, it really was a book targeted for white, able bodied, or I guess white, non disabled, cisgender, heterosexual women, right? Like it really had a very specific audience. But organizations around the world really started to put a lot of efforts into supporting women within the context of the workplace,
Right.
which was okay, except they didn't do it with an intersectional framework. And so it meant that it was advancing some women, but certainly not all women, right? And in more recent months, right, organizations who maybe even haven't ever talked about diversity, equity, inclusion before are suddenly talking about anti-racism and anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism, which we're very, very happy to see this, right? Because these are wildly overdue conversations and needs and demands. Uh, but you need to do all of these efforts in an intersectional way, right? No one person is sort of one thing, right? I'm not just a woman. I'm not just my sexual orientation, right? If I ask either of you to just tell me like, okay, tell me one identity factor that describes you and that's it, you're leaving so much of who you are and all of your complexity on the table, right? So when we only talk about gender or only talk about race, we're forgetting about the other, million different ways that people show up in the world and all of the other lived experiences that make, uh, you know, all of us important. So if orgs are trying to advance efforts that are gender first or only race first, um, that's okay. But ultimately, if it's not intersectional in its approach,
Right.
they're not going to actually do much. Like really little will change.
I mean, you make a good point there, where in terms of like the human person, or however you want to describe it, there's so many different traits and factors that belong to that individual that I feel like sometimes a lot of companies get lost in that whole anti-diversity, saying, "Oh, we need to hire X amount of African American individuals, or females, or whatever it may be." And I feel like that's not like the wholesome approach of diversity. And so I think you're spot on when you mentioned that whole aspect of that.
Totally, right. And I think a lot of organizations, like to your question, right, around recruitment, right, that a lot of organizations are sort of just using diversity, equity, inclusion as a marketing, promotional sort of pull, and that they're very much focused on the recruitment side of things. Absolutely, right, because that's the easiest part of this whole process.
Right.
It's actually really easy to recruit and get people in the door, right, to get people with a diversity of lived experiences through the door. It's not actually that hard. The hardest part is retaining them and making sure that once they're in the door, they actually have a good user experience on any given day, right? We know that there's a really awesome study from maybe about 2 years ago, the Tech Leaver study. I think it was led by the Capeware Institute. And what they ultimately found is that churn, or people leaving their jobs in tech, is really expensive. It costs the US tech ecosystem about $16 billion annually. So they're getting, all these orgs are getting these people in the door through their, recruitment strategies, but they're not keeping them because people are experiencing different forms of harassment and discrimination and all of the isms, all of the different forms of social inequity. So what was the point of investing all that time and energy on recruitment when people were out the door within 6 months anyways, right? Then they're going to go tell their friends about their not awesome experience. And ultimately, it's this spiral effect where that organization is actually going to end up with problems recruiting people, a diversity of people in, as they move forward.
And for companies that actually do it right in terms of building a diverse environment, what are the advantages that they have in the long term in terms of building, say, a business, but also from maybe the innovative gear in terms of like develop the business into like a unique value proposition from hiring and whatever it may be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the orgs that are most thoughtful in their approach, they won't focus on recruitment, external related stuff first. They'll focus internally. Like we always say, like, make sure things are good under the hood before you go and bring other people into your environment. Because if you haven't been really intentional about addressing, racism and discrimination and homophobia and transphobia and ageism and all of the things within your organization, then you're recruiting people with a whole range of lived experiences into your organization. And ultimately, you're recruiting them and putting them in unsafe spaces. So that sucks, right? So they're going to leave. So focus internally first, right? Make sure that your existing people are whole and happy, and that you're supporting them in the best way possible. And then you get that value add, like to your question, right? That when we build diverse teams, it means we have a variety of like lived experiences and perspectives around any given table. So when you're designing any type of technology, any type of innovation, like when you're designing a product, right, you're going to catch a lot of those gaps and blind spots in your process, and you have a better shot at developing or building something or designing something that will better serve the needs and desires of a diverse and global customer base. Right? We've seen countless examples of, say, an all male team, like all male engineering teams who build something. And guess what? A facial recognition software doesn't recognize racialized
Right.
faces, or some sort of voice recognition tools, right? That can't recognize people who use different dialects, right? Because they only train these systems using like North American accents, say, right?
Right.
How is that a useful product?
Right. And I actually can attest to that. So I'm not going to mention the company's name, but I used to work at a company that does work with those kind of tools. And oftentimes what we saw, and it was quite disturbing, that sometimes individuals with darker pigments could not be recognized properly. So like, say, for example, myself, who is South Asian, or someone who is of another ethnicity, it would be harder for us to get recognized on that social or that tool versus like the white individual.
So there's that, right? Like
Yeah.
being recognized properly, right? Which means, I don't know, maybe you can't open your phone, or, you can't use a piece of technology that you need to access. And then there's like an even darker flip side to this, right? Like, especially in the US, like facial recognition technologies are being used for all sorts of reasons. A lot of it relating to surveillance, to, the state and the prison industrial complex, and all of these things. And we already have good data to indicate that facial recognition technologies can't recognize racialized people's faces as well. So they're literally confusing people and putting people in jail based on these faulty technologies. It's scary.
Yeah.
For sure. And to that point too, even in Canada, that there's a transparency issue with that. I think the I'm not sure which region, but the police forces around Canada are starting to use some form of facial recognition, and they didn't disclose that until it kind of just leaked or something like that last year. So it's also that issue of, hey, we want to know what you guys are using, and how you're approaching how you're approaching your strategy, so that we can understand what to expect, and we don't have that.
Well, right, not just what they're using, but we need transparency around how everything is being built, right? Like, what is your product inclusion strategy? Who's at that table? Like, what are your ethical like testing protocols, right? There's so many layers that we have no idea, because so many of these tech companies function like a black box still.
For sure. And to that, so like that kind of brings us to your company, Feminuity. Am I saying that right?
Yep, you got it.
Awesome. So can we talk about your company, and kind of what your primary offering is right now, in terms of how you're helping companies navigate this kind of ecosystem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, many moons ago, when I was in my PhD, I looked at a range of different case studies in the field of innovation studies and technology studies, and it just became evident, right, that these fields considered themselves to be gender blind or racially blind, or sort of neutral, right? Like that they didn't need that human side of things. They didn't have to take into account when they were designing or shaping any type of technology. Like these problems come from, like, they're longstanding problems, right, in these spaces. And so I quickly realized that, we need to bring these lenses into these spaces, because we know that, AI and data driven solutions are shaping our lives today, now in real time, and well into the future, and in ways that people don't even understand,
Right.
right? And if we don't all have sort of a hand in this, we don't know what the future is going to bring, right? Because we can, with AI and data driven solutions, and, different forms of technology and platforms, we can scale inequality and inequities at warp speed, right? Like, it's actually really damning. So what we do is we work largely with those in the tech and innovation sector, to certainly make sure that their products, their technologies, like whatever it is they're building and shaping and bringing to the world, that they're following ethical protocols, that they're actually meeting the needs of a diverse and global customer base.
Right.
But beyond that, it's the people who shape the product, right? So we're working with them to certainly help them to build more diverse teams and organizations, to build more equitable processes and policies and systems, so those people want to stay within the organization in the first place, right? And can actually sort of feel whole and happy there. So yeah, we're a full service diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy firm, just working on sort of the end to end process.
For sure, yeah, and that's incredible. But what I want to kind of lean in on is how do you approach these companies when you're kind of leading these meetings and kind of having these conversations? Obviously it's a very sensitive topic, and a lot of times companies are more likely to be defensive immediately or kind of just kind of reject the idea that they need to implement these things. So how does your leadership team kind of approach these sensitive topics when you're approaching companies with your solutions?
Well, interestingly enough, we have never in the history of our business ever done any sort of external sales. Every client, every project, all the business that we've ever worked on has come to us first.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's a weird, interesting frame as an entrepreneur to say that we've never had to pitch per se, right? Because they've come to us first. I mean, sometimes, of course, we have to explain how it works and all of that stuff, but I think we've been fortunate, right? That people have a sense of the need. And what I think is even more difficult is that orgs will come to us and be really keen to work with us and to dig in on the project. And, once we do a really fulsome assessment of the organization, a quantitative survey and interviews and review their policies and practices and their product and then give them this findings report, right? A state of the nation. That's where the rubber hits the road. And that's where it's actually really difficult. And we'll find that, they wanted to do this, but then when we show them what it really entails to do this work well, they're not ready. Right. So that's when the hard conversations often really start, because it's like, you just collected all this data from your people. All of these voices are represented here. We found the gaps and the problems. Now it's up to you to move forward. But then, the excuses will be lack of time, lack of capacity, lack of financial resourcing, and so forth, right? Or not wanting to make big, bold changes that are required, right? To actually remedy whatever's going on there.
For sure. And I love that. It's like you're reading my mind here, because the next question I had for you can you give us an example of how a company, obviously you don't have to name any names and there's a confidentiality with that, but how they were hindering in their performance, perhaps based on their poor investment in this diversity and inclusion concept for their company itself?
Yeah. Honestly, one of the number one things that we see across the board is that these efforts, like, they usually come up through some sort of council or task force or group that sort of builds and springs out organically. They determine there's a need. So ultimately, one of the biggest problems is that organizations, after maybe we do an assessment, like, which we're external, so okay, we're paid, they expect that their people, this group of sort of volunteers, is going to lead these efforts and do all this work, right? Companies in the US and different places in the world, like, they have chief diversity officers and related roles. The majority of scales and larger in the US have like DEI leads or CDOs, whatever it may be, like people who are paid, who are experts with tons of experience in this field leading this work. But if you look at the Canadian tech ecosystem, Shopify is the only company that has such paid roles. So a big problem is that companies want this work done for free when this is a paid, like, are you going to hire, like, I don't know, like a marketing coordinator to lead your dev work? Like,
Yeah.
you need people with, the appropriate skill sets to do the work. So that's where it often falls apart, because they won't hire sort of a paid lead, or they won't fully resource the project. And so things just fall flat. There's this idea, right, that somehow this work is like soft, right? It's like that social science, humanities sort of soft efforts that somehow is easy to do. But we're talking about structural inequity. So I don't know why anyone would think that should be free or cheap to implement, right?
And maybe a question here I have on that is like, oftentimes smaller organizations have a certain budget that they can invest in, right? They usually have like say one or two HR resources. Do you think companies can invest in say training of these capabilities in terms of learning diversity and inclusion? Maybe because they can't hire like a standalone diversity inclusion officer, so maybe is training another way that they can kind of help address this gap?
Totally. And for like startups and like small orgs, they're in this beautiful spot where they haven't really accumulated too many of these really deep, complex problems yet, right? You're still in that sort of, you know, kind of,
Early stage.
yeah, like it's so much easier to tackle and nip things in the bud at that stage. So absolutely. Like when we work with startups and scale ups, we will often do a lot of certainly like educational related work, but really where we're sort of sharing our understanding and expertise and like giving them the playbook and skill sets and like trying to fill in their gaps, right? Like if someone knows how to rewrite job descriptions to a certain extent, then we'll swoop in and add the extra resources or weigh in and provide feedback so that they can actually learn how to do it moving forward. Building internal capacity, especially at the startup and scale up stage, is the best way to do this. And ultimately, we wouldn't need chief diversity officers or related roles or external consulting firms like us if orgs did this in the early days,
Early days, yeah.
all of their people to have this mindset and to just thread it into their practice, right? Marketing, comms, HR, product, and so forth.
For sure. Yeah, I love that. And that's a great example because I don't know how you guys feel about this. I'm not going to name names again, but there's a lot of companies that are already established now and they're hiring for that position, the CDO.
Yeah.
And it kind of ends up being like a figurehead. It's like they're just there as a role and you don't see it trickle down into anything. So the startup, like the startup perspective is incredible because now you can build out from the ground up and start from zero, right?
Yeah.
So on that point, and I'm sure this will be a free plugin for any company, but do you know of any companies that you think is doing an amazing job right now in terms of how they're approaching their diversity and inclusion kind of playbook?
Yeah, I mean, one organization that, in full transparency, yes, they're a client. It's the Weather Network, Pelmorex.
Right.
They're We've been working with them for a while now, and I'd say they're really thoughtful. They have a really dedicated group. They are paying these folks who are implementing these efforts. Sam Sebastian, their CEO, is all in. They're just committed and they know this is going to be like an incremental ongoing process that without like a clear finish line.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've been really cool to sort of witness through this process. They are slow, steady, and committed, and I think that's what we need.
That's awesome. So one of the things, I mean, we touched on it a little bit in our earlier question here, but one of the weaknesses I've seen, and I think many individuals of different minorities or different groups see, is like there is a lack of diversity when it comes to the leadership level. So we're talking about C-suite or maybe a level below that, VPs, and so. What do you think is the issue with in terms of representation and why there's such little representation today? And what do you think companies should do in terms of addressing that moving forward? Because it's sometimes hard if you can't really see that same individual on your group or level, and just have a relatability factor to that individual. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a tricky piece for sure. I think like really homogenous executive teams have the same problem as homogenous boards, right? They're sort of, those are usually fixed numbers of people, right? So it's not like you can overhaul this overnight unless you're just going to like wipe out your board or fire your full exec team, right? Then this is going to take some time. So I think it's about supporting that internal pipeline, right? So yeah, your internal folks to help them sort of get ready to take over when there are openings. One model that I really like is the idea of one, two, or three sort of empty chairs. So, sort of adding in kind of like a temporary role on an executive team so that they can immediately start to get voices and lenses and frames that are just missing from their group in there, right? And like maybe you just have like maybe that you have people coming in for 3 month or 4 month terms, like some sort of like way to just infuse more voices. Um,
Right.
Definitely execs, if they're deeply homogenous, like they need to open up as many different channels as possible for feedback from their people, right, across all layers and levels. Um, and those are really important parts. I also think that sometimes organizations need to really look at themselves in the mirror and determine, like, are all of these folks at the executive level or on this board sincerely committed, and are they actually people who are going to be aligned with where we're going to go on our DEI journey, or are they going to be blockers, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people just aren't meant to come with an organization as they sort of progress and learn and get better, right? So sometimes it also looks like having some hard conversations and sort of weeding out the people who simply don't want a more equitable organization. And people don't like to talk about that part of it.
For sure.
I think it is a touchy topic because, once you establish like a leadership team, it's really hard to say, oh, we have to kind of fit whatever the mold is of society. Because one, it might be unfair to that individual just being, secluded out. But I feel like, to your point, I never thought about that little rotating seat kind of thing. That's super, super innovative. And I think like a lot of companies could benefit from that. And just maybe having, again, that whole different perspective. I think diversity, just those ideas that come out of a unbiased lens or just a different perspective really helps businesses, I think, scale and grow in different ways that a lot of companies couldn't think of before.
I also think, though, to a level of leadership that gets overlooked are managers, right? Like managers are that glue. They're often the folks that more junior folks have the most interaction with. So yes, absolutely, work on your executive team, your senior levels, your board, and so forth, and get really intentional and set those targets. But also, you can do a lot, right, by really leveling up your managers and ensuring representation at that level as well, and just equipping them, right, so that
Yeah,
your people want to stay, right?
For
exactly.
sure. Yeah, that's a great point because on the day to day, you're more likely to be working with your manager more than an executive, so to speak. So one of the things that you mentioned while you were joining this call was that you couldn't update your pronouns on Zencaster, and that's what I wanted to talk about next year. So over the past several years, we've kind of witnessed that dialogue around gender identification become politicized, and in some cases even weaponized. So what I wanted to start with was how did gender-related studies become such a polarizing topic in today's age right now? Like, what can you speak to that on that?
How did gender studies become so polarizing? That's
And I'm working off the concept of representing and expressing your pronouns that you identify with, because as an example, I've had friends who've updated their LinkedIn profiles with their pronouns to say he, her, or he, whatever it is, right? And they've had people message them to be like, why did you feel the need to update this, right? Like they've had people do that. And on the flip side, my LinkedIn does not have one, and I've had people message me, whether they're bots or not, I'm not sure, but to be like, how am I supposed to, what are you, like, how do we address? And it's like, why is this such, like, how did this become such a polarizing topic today?
interesting. I think it's just a lack of understanding, right? Generally, I find with any conversation relating to pronouns or beyond, once you actually kind of sit down and have a heart to heart with someone and give them some context about why you're using such a practice or why you're using such language, um, it tends to actually be okay. So as it relates to pronouns, there's a lot to sort of understand around it, but ultimately for me, I use pronouns as a signal to folks, to trans folks, to non-binary folks, to folks whose gender sort of extends beyond the gender binary in the traditional sense.
Right.
I use them as a signal to normalize the practice, especially for folks who use pronouns other than she, her, he, him, right? That are sort of normalized, right? And at least in North American culture. So I do it because I want to normalize a practice so that other people who perhaps don't feel quite as comfortable sharing their pronouns might feel just a bit more comfortable. And I also use it as a signal to folks that, I'm someone who's willing to learn and grow and to sort of act in solidarity. And hopefully that's a signal that maybe they'll want to reach out to me, that I can support them in some way.
For sure. Yeah. And I feel like there's definitely kind of a generational gap in that, because this kind of topic wasn't addressed in the past generations. And those people are the ones who are in C-suite positions now, and not being able to kind of converse with the new people coming into the workforce in that range. So can you speak to how we can kind of bridge that gap between the various generations? Because obviously there's a lot of like unpacking in terms of where we start that education. Like I'm not sure if it needs to be right in the workplace or in school. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah. I'm of the mindset that there needs to be just a low bar for entry for people who want to get better and learn and elevate social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion across the board. So when people make mistakes and they, come to me with a lack of understanding, I view that as an awesome opportunity, right? Because I learn things every day. I mess up every day. Like there is no end to all that we can ever understand in this space. So I think having a really capacious frame on the fact that we're all at different stages of a learning journey and we need to support each other to sort of level up our understanding is just important overall, right? Coming at people with blame or shame or like accusatory tones, that sucks. They're probably not going to listen to you and they probably don't want to hear what you have to say. But I think, if my grandmother died a couple years ago, but like before she died, she was well versed in technology. If she can understand how to operate the latest iPhone and the latest iOS and all of that good stuff, then we can, learn how to continue to evolve our practices relating to language or pronouns or, how we interact with people. Growth mindset is everything, right? And if you have executive CEOs who don't have a growth mindset, that's tough for sure.
Right. Yeah.
And do
And
you
that's,
think?
sorry, go
Sorry,
ahead.
sure. Oh, I was just going to say, do you think that kind of mindset trickles down to the workforce then too? If I guess leadership always has that mentality, and they kind of spread the values and missions down towards a company. And if you're kind of secluded in that thought process of not changing with times, do you think that spreads, and that's why you see all these issues like turnover in terms of employees and stuff like that start occurring?
Totally. I think I've been learning this myself in a more actualized way in recent years. Like the gaps, the issues, the unpacked baggage, whatever it is of CEOs, of execs and leaders. Yeah, for sure. It finds its way into your company culture. So that's a wild responsibility, right? Imagine when I think about, especially in sort of tech or really sort of male dominated industries, like if certain execs had maybe just engaged some mental health support, got some counseling, some therapy, like they probably wouldn't have such not awesome cultures that they're scaling,
Yeah.
right? Like leaders like need to check themselves and work on themselves continually. Yes, because all of our stuff can just bleed out into the organization. And then, as you grow, you can actually scale it with policies and structures and all of that too, right? And then you actually codify it.
I think everyone should go to therapy at least once. Like there's always something that you don't know about yourself that you're going to unpack there. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. We've been talking about this topic of, ideology here in this sense. One of the topics that have come up, at least last year, was, we saw movements that occurred, including BLM. During those movements, we saw a lot of individuals take to social media to show their support for the movement. And while others, unfortunately did not, they had kind of the opposite viewpoints. So my question to you is kind of like, how do companies kind of handle differing opinions, and what is like the fine line when it comes to this conversation? Because when is it clear to an employer that that individual no longer belongs to the company?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, I think it starts with organizations getting really clear on their mission, purpose, and values, on sort of the rules of engagement or like the sort of the code of conduct that they actually expect of their people. And until they get clear on that, I think it's hard to then determine how everyone fits around that, right? So when organizations really crystallize their values and what they'll stand for, and like a really significant commitment to being a more equitable organization, I find people just, it becomes obvious, right? When people are no longer going to be aligned. A really good example, like to our piece before around pronouns, is it's come up many times over the years. Employees refusing to refer to their colleagues by their stated pronouns, saying, why should I do that? Or goodness knows, whatever reasons. And then, ultimately that's something that finds its way to HR. And so we have a lot of HR leaders reaching out and saying, like, well, what do I do? What do I do when someone refuses to refer to someone with their stated pronouns? I.e., they keep misgendering someone over and over in the workplace. And ultimately, what our advice usually is saying, well, that's a performance management issue. That person is not adhering to your stated values as an organization. They are refusing to learn and grow. And, that's what we expect of leaders in 2021 and beyond. So that's a fireable thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And do you feel like sometimes, like, I'm just going to be putting it on like two fences. There's obviously conservatism, there's liberalism, and there's a fine line between each of those kind of ideologies. Obviously, 2021, I feel like we lean more towards like a liberal society, and obviously that's where I say Canada and America is. But for those individuals, say that are, I say, a bit more conservative, maybe because due to religious practices or other things that have surrounded them through their upbringing, how do we involve and include those individuals in making sure they're not secluded from the work environment? Because maybe say 80% of the work environment is more liberal, or it just doesn't understand their ideology.
Yeah, I really think it's about building bridges and creating moments for communication and sharing stories and people sharing their perspectives. Um, we can all hold sort of the values that we hold, but it's also still up to us to treat others within the context of the workplace with dignity and respect, and it's up to us to affirm them as they need us to, right? And so using their stated pronouns would be a good example of affirming people as they ask us to, right? So I don't think I think it's about building bridges, and ultimately, we've had this conversation a lot around the use of inclusive language, right? Sometimes people say like, oh my gosh, like I can't say anything anymore. Like, like we're kind of trapped in this PC culture. But my argument often is like, this isn't about being politically correct. Political correctness is actually useless, right? Because it doesn't actually let us have real, authentic conversations. It's sort of just like a veneer that we're functioning within. Um, if I find out that I say something, I use a word or a phrase or expression, and then someone comes to me and tells me, like that sucked because, that hurt my feelings because X, Y, or Z. I'm going to hear that. And then if there is a better word or a better phrase or a better expression that I can use, then why wouldn't I opt for it? If I can use a language that has a better chance of being affirming to people, I'm going to opt for it. Like it's just really simple. Like these are small things that we can do to just make the world and any given day easier for each other, especially in the midst of a pandemic and a wildly complex world, right?
Yeah.
Opting to just do what we can.
Exactly. And, I love your approach to that too. It's just not about, being politically correct. It's more beyond that sense. You have to actually have that dialogue between each other. So I feel like that's a great point you just made. So kind of rounding things off here in terms of, the work that you do and also kind of the culture that is within the workplace and in society today. You recently released like a blog on your website related to cultural appropriation around how Black content creators were finding, their content at the bottom of pages on apps like TikTok. So, you've mentioned like sometimes applications are not doing that well in terms of the diversity and inclusion piece. Can you kind of walk us through your findings and, what came about from this blog?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest takeaways that we'd hope folks have from a blog like that is that there's just so much of sort of Black culture, right? Like things that are developed by Black creators they're just not given credit, right? Like they're not like there's just there's just so much that's sort of stolen from Black culture, and that sucks. I think that's what we care about a lot. And how do we ensure that these creators who are creating all this like brilliant content that's making money for so many people, right?
Right.
So many marketers, so many businesses, why aren't they getting a cut of that? Like, they deserve to be compensated for their creativity and effort. And I think that's actually something that we're really thinking about.
For sure. Yeah. So that kind of wraps up like the bulk of our questions related to your work. We like to kind of round out our podcast episodes with a fun little lightning round where we're going to toss a bunch of quick questions at you and hopefully get some interesting answers here. So, can you tell us your favorite book or movie of all time?
Oh my gosh. That's so hard. Favorite book of all time. Home Alone. I love Home Alone.
That's a classic. Okay.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay. So you've had a long day at work. You come home. How do you like to unwind?
Well, I was already home because,
That's fair.
Yeah.
So you've had a long day at home. How do you unwind?
Yeah. I take my dog out. We go down to the water. We go for a run. Gordon and I, plus fresh air is a good way to do it.
Nice.
Love it. Dogs are always awesome. So if you were to pick one person to have dinner with, dead or alive, who would that be?
My dad. He died when I was about 6, and yeah, I'd love to know him more as an adult.
For sure. We love that. And last question here is one of our more our controversial questions, I guess you can say. We like to ask all of our guests, do you like pineapple on your pizza?
I like double olives and nothing else.
It's funny. We had this conversation. I think the last like 4 or 5 guests have just said no to pineapple. So you're on my kind of side there.
So thank you so much. This is kind of a great conversation. I think your company is doing incredible work, and obviously it's a testament to the work that you are doing, that people are approaching you more than you have to reach out to them. And we're looking forward to seeing where your company goes and kind of where the culture moves as we kind of learn and educate ourselves more on these topics.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this year, 2021, is the year of accountability, right? Every organization on the planet released these wild statements, these big commitments, right? Soon after the murder of George Floyd. And so this year is the year where they need to actually follow up and act
Right.
on that stuff. So this is the year where the rubber hits the road.
For sure. Yeah. And
It's a great
people
way
tend to have short-term memory. So hopefully we hold these companies accountable.
Well, thankfully, they have lots of employees who read those statements. So
Yeah. I want to see how these big tech companies actually implement it in terms of not even big tech, even just like organizations out of tech. We saw all those colorized logos and stuff during everything. So let's like to your point, let's see if it actually happens now.